Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to episode 10 of Islamicity Weekly. Joining me as always is my colleague and co-founder of Islamicity, Hassan Labuskakhni, coming in from the Western Cape. Today we're quite honored and privileged to have Dr. Raadhiyah Noordien, who is a medical professional, being a medical doctor from the Tree of Health medical practice. Dr. Raadhiyah has written an open letter to our various halal certifying bodies in South Africa to emphasize the need for tayyib. The Quran, the Sunnah, the Deen commands us to eat that which is permissible and also that which is wholesome and good for us. And to engage the discussion of halal and tayyib, we are going to be speaking to Dr. Raadhiyah Noordien. Shukran for joining us, Dr. Raadhiyah.
Wa alaikum salam. Shukran for having me on your show.
If Doctor could perhaps just give us another, an introduction on what Doctor's background has been in medicine up until now, and what really led Doctor up to the point of realizing that there is, a crucial need for us to perhaps assess what we are putting in our bodies as Muslims, and not just go on based on a halal certificate.
Absolutely. Shukran for that. So, a bit of background. I studied at Stellenbosch University in the Western Cape, and I qualified in December of 2011. I then completed my internship and community service. Thereafter, I was permanently appointed to a community health center in Crossroads in Cape Town, where I worked for the next 9 years. Primarily, I was working in an HIV unit. Thereafter, I was in charge of the emergency department. At the same time, I was also doing overtime at both Tutuzela, Victoria Hospital and Tutuzela in Kalbrema, where I was doing gender-based violence work. So I was essentially the on-call doctor for any gender-based violence cases that came in at night. I did that for about 5 years whilst continuing my work at Crossroads. Up until last year, I resigned in June. It was a very significant decision for me because I felt that I'd kind of reached my point or my cap in the government sector, because I was seeing a lot of disease. The burden of disease is quite great in that area that I was working in, and there was just very little that I was able to practically do, because the prescribed guidelines are so rigid. And so in identifying some gaps and some, things which were almost counterintuitive to the diseases that we were treating, the only viable option for me was to leave, to establish something that I'd built from the ground up, and then manage diseases according to a more Quranic, more Sunnah way, where people are actually prioritized. It's not about the bottom line. It's not about pushing numbers essentially, but listening to patients and offering wholesome health education, wholesome, advice to them, so that they're actually able to make meaningful changes to their lives. And eventually, after 6 months, I'd hope to, discharge them and see them walk away quite well. And so that's essentially where and how Tree of Health was formed, with the idea that it would be or become a center where, people can trust the kind of health care that was coming out of this place, that people could see that you walk in sick, with a very complicated chronic disease, and there's a possibility that you can walk away without your medication, completely well, purely using food and natural options, as your form of medication. Um, so obviously looking into the chronic diseases that we were faced with, obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, hypertension, even to an extent, depression, it's all so clearly linked to the foods that we eat. And when you actually tackle those things and you change what you eat, you are able to 100%, reverse those chronic ailments and live a healthy life. So it's on that basis that, I'm a I'm a Muslim first, and in every aspect of my life, I refer to Quran and to Sunnah and to Sharia to guide what I do as a mother, what I do as a wife, what I do as a doctor. And I think with that as my foundation, it's just been such a clear guiding light. And it's led me to ask these questions, because I see serious shortcomings in the way that our foods are currently being certified, in that, the certification still leads to ill health, it still leads to diseases, but nobody's asking that, pertinent questions. Because at what point, do these halal authorities say, this is enough disease, this is enough of a burden to our ummah for us to actually make some serious changes? So essentially, that's a brief introduction to who I am, and what journey I'm on, and the methodology that I use to go about this business. Yeah.
When you started your practice, I believe it was in Dieprivier, you for the first time really came into contact with a lot of sort of middle-class Muslim families, many Muslims that were fairly well educated and that were earning quite decent salaries, but they were coming in with all of these diseases, like you mentioned just now, metabolic diseases. So just as an assessment right now, what would you say is the state of our eating habits as Muslims currently? Is it on a scale from 1 to 10, is it like really terrible, the things that we are consuming, sort of as a custom, in our households? Or are we, fairly healthy, somewhere in the middle, or is it perhaps good?
I think if I must be completely honest, I think we 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 try, right? But the cultural aspect of what you mentioned, it puts us at a one, maybe at a two, but nowhere near where we need to be. And as we mentioned in the previous discussion, coming to Deep River, being in a middle class community, seeing a lot of young patients who are overburdened, with diseases, with a busy lifestyle, with raising children, and having career aspirations and so on. It's almost become normal and okay to be diabetic at the age of 35, to have hypertension at the age of 30. It's a norm. And in all of these instances, the patients are noticeably obese. We don't like to use that word. We don't like to coin it. People are uncomfortable around it. But our we've become accustomed to being a larger size. So culturally, we are at a serious disadvantage because it's been ingrained in the way we cook around functions, because Islam is it's a very social religion in Cape Town. At least I can speak from where I come from, where every Thursday night there's a dhikr, there's buber, there's vermicelli, there's, sweet treats. Any function whatsoever, you will come with a plate of something to that function, and it's hardly ever a fruit platter. It's hardly ever, something that is truly wholesome. I mean, all the foods are practically halal, but it is of poor tayyib quality, essentially. And because it's been ingrained and passed down from generation to generation, those habits, it's difficult to break. But I think that in my patient population that I've built up so far, a lot of them are very eager because they realize that, something needs to be done. And that wake up call only comes when a diagnosis has been put next to their name. Before that, there's no real impetus to change because there's no real need, because comfort and because money, and it brings excess, and that excess unfortunately brings disease. So it's become quite popular actually for patients to come and ask me for Ozempic, for instance, if we were just to chat about that quickly, because it's in the mainstream media, it's being marketed quite heavily. Obviously, lots of celebrities are using it, and now it's become available. But it's primarily marketed as a diabetic treatment, but off-label there's a use for weight loss. So patients are prepared to pay, 4,000 Rand a month for their supply. They're willing to take all the side effects along with a black box warning of thyroid cancer, because they are so desperate to lose the weight. They're so desperate to be well, but don't quite know how, because um, you know, that information is just not available to them. So generally, as doctors, we are not trained in nutrition. You know, it's if we look at our program, maybe uh, 10 or 12 hours out of the entire 6-year program, 7-year program is dedicated to nutrition. And it's always a side item, you know, it's never really the focus of our training. So a lot of doctors feel, you know, out of their depth when it comes to discussing nutritional aspects with the patients. And so as a knee jerk, we just give lengthy prescriptions because that's the training that we actually received, you know. But patients now have gotten to the point where they have a serious pill fatigue. You know, the pill burden is so high that they are just not interested in taking that medication, you know. So having a disease and not taking the medication and not doing anything about it, you know, is just, it's a bad combination, as opposed to not taking your medication but having a nutritional program that you're working on in order to reverse that illness, you know. So there's a massive gap in the medical fraternity, you know, among doctors specifically, you know, in giving patients that advice that they really need, taking the time, having 30-minute consultations as opposed to 15-minute quick consultations, you know, with patients in order to actually get to the root cause of their diseases and help them walk that journey to reverse the damage that has been caused, you know. So coming from the public health sector, we didn't have time to consult, to have lengthy consultations. It was very quick because we had a large number of patients we had to see to. So coming into this environment, the biggest blessing for me is that I determine how long my consultation slots are, you know, and I book accordingly. And I make sure that I give my patients, you know, especially those coming for lifestyle issues, I give them 45 minutes, I give them an hour, because that's the least you can do for them, you know. It's impossible to have these 15-minute slots and actually educate the patient enough for them to have the confidence and the willpower to sustain that change, you know. So it's extremely difficult. It's a path that's not been walked by many in this environment, you know. It's uncommon for GPs in particular to offer this, mainstream GPs, you know. But I find that my patients have responded so well to just having someone listen to them, that once we get the message across, you know, that more GPs would follow suit and offer these kinds of services to the patients.
Doctor, you mentioned earlier that, you know, there is like a very serious problem. I don't know if you could call it an epidemic, but I suppose, you know, based on South Africa's obesity figures, I would say it's an epidemic. But, you know, in the Muslim community in the Western Cape, some of the patients that doctor has seen, you know, they are presenting with obesity. And if we think about the connection between that and the cultural foods that we are used to, and, you know, for instance, in Ramadan, your dalchis and your buber and all of those, you know, sweet treats and your samosas and all of those things, people could say, you know, if we go back in time, maybe 50 years, there, you know, it seems there has been an increase in obesity, but the kind of cultural delicacies that we are consuming hasn't really changed that much. So what accounts for that increase in obesity? Is it, you know, that perhaps halal certification has been given to all of these fast food businesses, and our people are just, you know, relying on that more because they're busier and they don't have time to cook, and so they just pop through the drive-through? Or is it something else? Is it our stressful lifestyle? What are the main contributors to obesity in our community at the moment?
So the biggest contributor is sugar, you know, plain and simple, is refined white sugar, you know, and it's so prevalent in absolutely every single item that you can find. That, for instance, I've many references for studies because the studies are so meaningful, you know, and it's so big, you know, involving 2.2 million people, for instance, you know, where they actually look at sugar consumption and the relation between sugar and obesity. So you must understand what sugar does, right? So sugar spikes your insulin. Obviously, that's the first thing it does. And it encourages overeating. And it disrupts your natural appetite regulatory system in your body. So when you eat sugar, you lose that off switch, that we should automatically have. And when you look at the rate at which we are consuming sugar, it is alarming because, for instance, in a 500 ml cool drink, fizzy cool drink, whether it be Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Jive, or in a 500 ml can of cool drink, there's no less than 13 teaspoons of sugar in there. Okay, that's one beverage. And oftentimes people consume more than one beverage in a day, or at a larger size. So if you just look at how prevalent sugary beverages are in our community, that it's at every table, at every function, often different varieties, then already that's a culprit that is looking at you. Okay. If you take it back even a step further, if you look at baby formula, for instance, also certified as halal, sugar also certified as halal. If you look at baby formula, the two key ingredients in there is sucrose, right, which is sugar, and palm oil. So what this does early to an infant is it sensitizes that infant to sugar, okay? And so they know the taste of sugar or sweet things at a very young age. So as that infant grows, they have a pre-selection, or they enjoy, or they would choose sugary tasting things and foods over other foods, and so from a very early age children are being programmed. So babies are extremely fat when they're drinking formula, but our community says it's a healthy baby, because it's a fat baby. When that fat baby doesn't quite outgrow that fat as a toddler, as a child, it becomes baby fat, and then in the teenage years, now it's stubborn, metabolically active fat, in a child now, in a teenager who is obese, at a time where there's lots of peer pressure, lots of emotions going around, and that comfort food is a sugary something that that child has been, you know, given or sensitized to from infancy. So it's a perpetual cycle that affects us at all different stages of our life, and this is why we are stuck with the epidemic that we have. So sugar has been linked to 7 different kinds of cancers, 18 different kinds of metabolic disorders, That's not to talk about the dental issues, the neuropsychiatric ADHD, learning disorders, and so on. So the effects of sugar is clearly documented, And I must say that I was actually called by the MJC in Cape Town, and they actually requested a meeting. And I had an opportunity to actually raise these points with them, because my concern is we are poisoning our ummah, we are poisoning uh, our community from infancy, from the moment they are born, right throughout our entire life. And the burden of disease is so overwhelming. It's so evident. You cannot deny it, Is it not time for us to really look at the halal certification of sugar when we see that it leads to these diseases, right? So if we take something like cigarettes, for instance, it's not considered halal, right? But there's no halal certification on the box. But it's not haram either, because our community still smokes, right? But the effects of cigarette smoke is so well documented, and it has a warning on the box because we know of the link between lung cancer. So why not offer the same courtesy to sugar? Why not warn the public about it? And so if we look at these halal certifying bodies, why not put a label on sugar and say that it's halal because it's technically halal, there's no pork in there, there's no alcohol in there, but this is not good for you. It may make people realize, because sugar is so prevalent on our tables, everywhere we look, and it is one of the leading drivers of the disease uh, epidemic that we find ourselves living through. But unless our authorities take that stance, it's very difficult, to make an impact on the ground level, from the bottom up, if our authorities are not saying the same thing.
It's interesting to me that when you were mentioning the effect of sucrose or sucralose and how it sort of programs the baby to have this um, predilection and this yearning for sugar, and then immediately when they start tasting sugary foods, they just recognize it and it just sets something off. And then, step by step as they get older, the weight that they're carrying with them, it affects them in different ways through different stages of their lives. And it made me think of one of the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually speaks about halal and tayyib. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nasu kulu mimma fil ardi halalan tayyiban ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, on the one hand, O people, not just O you believe, but O all people, eat from what Allah has given you on this earth that is halal, permissible, and tayyib. And then right after that, Allah mentions وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Do not follow the footsteps of shaitan. So, indicating to us that shaitan takes you step by step. So from the beginning, I just thought about it, how step by step that sugar and those non-tayyib foods, throughout your entire life, it worsens your condition step by step systematically. And perhaps there's, Allahu Alam, but there's a wisdom behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioning shaitan and halal and tayyib in the same verse. And so perhaps I think at this stage, what we should ask ourselves as Muslims is what actually is tayyib, because I think a lot of Muslims are familiar with halal because they associate halal just with whether it's an NJC stamp or whether it's a Sanha stamp or NIHT stamp. They know, okay, this is halal, I can eat this. But many of us are not aware of the concept of tayyib, halalan tayyiban. So perhaps doctor can, elaborate a bit on that. What is the differentiation between just halal, and tayyib?
So obviously, I'm coming from a Islamic background, but in doing my research, halalan is a technical qualification of food, in terms of the way the animal is slaughtered, the environment that the animal was in prior to that slaughter, and then the way the food or the meat is obviously processed, right? So that is the halalan aspect. Also, whether or not alcohol was involved, for instance, in the production. So halalan simply is an indication that there is no alcohol, or that the animal was slaughtered in a way that is in accordance with the Islamic practices. That's the only thing that the halalan aspect speaks about. The tayyib part is actually where it talks about wholesomeness, food that is beneficial, that is wholesome, that is nourishing, that is nutritious. So I think in total in the Quran, I speak under correction, Allah mentions halal and tayyib together 4 times, twice in Surah Baqarah, in Surah Ma'idah, and in Surah Nahl. So there is a reason why Allah mentions that together, and we see what the implication is for this entire world when we, with our human interpretation of Allah's laws, when we come up with a solution, for instance, when we break up Allah's prescription. Had we followed Allah's prescription as it was prescribed, we would not be in this position that we find ourselves in, And this is my argument, is that at what point is it okay for us to separate halal and tayyiban? For us as mere mortals to take that prescription and divide it, because you can have something that is halal but not tayyib, but you can't have something that is, because anything that is tayyib by definition would also be halal. So I think the tayyib classification is the more important and all-encompassing part of that halal and tayyiban. And if you look at the maqasid of Sharia, which are the objectives of Sharia, which is what we should be living by, we have to ensure that we have the preservation of our life and health, which is a very important, point of Sharia law. So when we see that our interpretation of Allah's law is now clashing with another, point of Sharia, then we have to force ourselves to look, because Allah's laws are perfect. Allah's laws are flawless. Allah's laws are beneficial. There's no way that Allah would allow us to consume certain foods that would lead to our direct destruction. It is counterintuitive. It goes against, the greatness of our Creator. So it is something that is very important to me. I feel very passionate about creating the awareness and letting our community know that they are entitled to tayyib. It's not the optional extra. It is something that we as consumers should demand because it's not something unreasonable. Um, I think the evidence, the scientific evidence is clear enough for any ulama body to come to the conclusion that things like seed oil, things like energy drinks, like sugar, should not have that halal stamp on it because it leads to the destruction of the masses. It's not it may or you may be lucky to, if you consume X amount of those substances for X amount of years, you will. It's a certainty that you will have that problem. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, there's not enough people who think about food in that way. For us, looking when we turn that back around and we see the halal stamp, that's enough. We don't read the ingredients. We don't take it any further than that. Because we feel that authority had taken the necessary steps to ensure that this is a good enough product for me to consume. And what was very interesting was in my meeting with the MJC, the CEO clarified from the get-go that the halal stamp does not signify that this product is healthy, which I don't think many people actually realized, that you still go and you consume that product at your own risk. That certification is not an endorsement of the nutritional benefit that you will find in that product. And so the responsibility falls to us as the consumer to actually take care or be cautious and be careful in terms of what we are consuming. And because the food industry is largely driven by cost and by profits, if we don't hold them to account, if our halal authorities don't hold those industries to account or to a higher standard, we are not going to get any better quality food coming out. Because at the end of the day, they want to use the cheapest ingredients, to create a product that would give them the biggest profit margin. That's ultimately what it comes down to, And if our authorities are not, having our best interests at heart, then we need to go and remind them that this is a standard that we need to have in our food. We need them to have our back because our lives are so busy. We don't have the time, to become food experts ourselves. And I think in there is the problem in that area. And I speak now on behalf of the impoverished community, who are given refined flour, who's given seed oil, who's given processed meat, who's given sugar as a basic staple in their diet. So you're attacking them on 4 levels at the same time in one meal. There's no wholesome element in that food package that we're essentially giving to them. So it's not simply about feeding, a family or feeding people. It's about ensuring that that food doesn't cause damage, in the long run. When that breadwinner now develops diabetes, has to have an amputation. Worse, if he dies, who now takes care of that family? So it's very important for us to be mindful that if we are in a position of authority where we are expected to take care of the people around us, that we should actually, hold up that amana and make sure that we, from our end, are as transparent as we can be in terms of what is actually going in our food.
I'm hearing what you're saying, but the question is that how are we going to ensure tayyib, like wholesome, good, nutritious food? Are we talking about the tayyib certification? Can you talk us through that? What would this look like? Because would it mean to say that a new halal body is created? Are we going to say that we're going to almost perhaps re-engineer our current existing halal certifying bodies? And there are a few of them in the country. It's the MJC, it's SANHA, South African National Halal Authority, it's the National Independent Halal Trust, there's a good few bodies that are involved in certifying the foods that we eat. So are we going to say, for example, we're going to re-engineer these various halal certification bodies in a way that they're now going to be looking for tayyib, what is good and wholesome? And in your, based on your expertise and your vision, what would this look like, potential tayyib certification?
So again, I can only speak from the interaction that I've had with the MJC. Okay, so at the moment, the classification in terms of halal cannot change, because it's a legal and a technical classification. It's a structured program that I think has been adopted and is used worldwide. So it's essentially trying to get food technically clean and pure without any alcohol and slaughtered in an ethical way, right? So I don't think we'll succeed in getting them to change the halalan aspect of it. Okay, the discussion that must be had is how do we create a tayyib certification? Okay, and what would the structure look like? Would it entail a tiered approach? To say that it is halal and tayyib, which would be at the highest level. It would only be halal. It would be partially tayyib, for instance, so that we can incorporate the existing structure of halal and add the tayyib part. It shouldn't be seen as something that is going to come and overtake or replace or threaten the halal marketing or industry or bodies, etc. Initially walking into that meeting, it was my hope that these bodies already established, already having that groundwork done, just simply add a tayyib certification to their process. But they made it very clear that it's not that easy. It's not simply just amending it because, for whatever, implications there would be, that it is more about sitting and developing a tayyib certification criteria, and starting from scratch. My concern with that is because you would now get baby formula certified halal, but not tayyib, So what does that leave you with? It would create somewhat of a confusion, because do I go for halal and do I not look at halal? Do I not consider it anymore? Do I just go for tayyib? So if we're going to create a new body, it may create confusion. So at the moment, nobody has developed a tayyib certification. It does not exist worldwide, and so it's a very good gap in the market, essentially, for somebody to come in and to work on this halal, on the tayyib certification process. But as in most things, it should be driven by tayyibness, by wholesomeness, and not uh, with financial, implications and so on. Obviously, there would be a cost involved in terms of running and setting up, but there's always this concern that when any new body starts, that when money comes in, that it kind of corrupts that process. So it has to be managed in a very structured and strategic way to ensure that wholesomeness carries through, from the start, in the way that organization is set up, to the way, it looks at production plants and, the effects on the environment and so on. So it's a very important discussion for us to keep having, and to keep having at the family level, at the community level, at the senior, ulama level, for instance, because it's going to take a serious amount of hard work, in terms of to pioneer this process. But if we continue the way that we are going, then our ummah is doomed, unfortunately, because we don't have alternatives. There are no tayyib alternatives that are readily available for the masses. So the option is either to starve or to consume products that are halal, but that are actually not good for you in the long run, you know. So it's a very difficult position that we find ourselves in. But as Muslims, we must always be hopeful, that Allah has given us the solutions. Allah has already given us a the criteria, And so it's just going to take like-minded people, food engineers, ulama who are knowledgeable in the food, doctors, nutritionists, dietitians, to come together and really work on a tape certification, And I'm looking for like-minded people, I'm willing to put my name down, to roll up my sleeves and get involved because I am so passionate about this, But we need to encourage this conversation so that more and more people become aware. People know that halal is not enough, that we need to start demanding from our ulama that they take our food to a higher and a cleaner level, so that it can ensure that this ummah can actually live long enough, live well enough. Because what we mustn't forget is that when we are not well, it affects the way we perform our ibadah. It affects the way we make dua. It affects the way we are able to connect to our maker, Someone who is using lots of pain medication because they can't feel their feet because they are diabetic, for instance, the way that person makes salah, as opposed to someone who is well fed, who is centered and connected to their maker, there's significant implications in terms of our spirituality, which we haven't even touched on, So it's not only a physical issue, it's a spiritual issue as well. And if we make enough noise and if we raise these concerns with our halal certifying authorities, maybe they would then, take it more serious. It would be the impetus for them to then start and eagerly work on this Tayyib certification.
My concern, and I'm hearing you, and I believe that our food needs to be tayyib. So I'm with you in this fight. Uh, and I'm not saying that this is the reason why we should not pursue this, but tayyib certification, the cost of tayyib certification, and I'm not speaking about the Muslim community having to set up infrastructure and hiring and appointing the correct trained professionals to ensure that something is very healthy, right? But that cost of maybe taste certification being on a food item, right, is going to be borne by the consumer. And in a country, for example, with very high unemployment rates and being the most unequal society in the world, that means that the poorest of the poor are going to be bearing the cost of TAYEB certification, and that does present a huge problem. So could it be possible that, for example, that this fight for basically nutritious food is one that's not confined and championed only by the Muslim community, but really has to be platformed on a national level through public policy, where basically government has to now take a very firm stance to say that whatever food is going to be consumed within the Republic of South Africa, that it's actually going to be nutritious. Now, I know this may sound like fiction, but how do we actually do it? Is this even possible? And you've been involved in public health, and you've seen basically the trenches of the public health institutions. So, is there any hope there?
I think it's a difficult question because that public health sector is already overburdened as it is, and not necessarily because there isn't funds available. There's often a lot of misappropriation of those funds, right? So it takes you into a different battle altogether. But it's unfortunate because a lot of our healthy food stores, a lot of our healthy options, that we can afford, the more organic butchers, for instance, it's something that only people who have money are able to access at the moment in any case, So because you're poor, it means you have to eat low quality, unhealthy foods, because there isn't an alternative for you. So I think when we have this discussion, people who are non-Muslim, when they see the beauty of the prescription of Allah in terms of having tayyib food, it is only natural that they too will want to have that food, So it's not something that is only carried by the Muslim community, but it is now something that is echoed by our non-Muslim brothers and sisters in South Africa as well, Whether or not we will succeed in getting it at the national policy level to actually implement those changes is something that I think it shouldn't overwhelm us and cause us to not move at all. I think if we plant those seeds in our lifetime and we're able to see, if we're not able to see that fruits, but our children or our grandchildren and great grandchildren, then I think it's a fight that we should not give up on. It's something that may not, translate into healthy foods on the shelf for poorer people tomorrow or next week or next year, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having that conversation. Poor people still deserve, those foods. And what was very, shocking to me is that a lot of our ulama, they know that sugar is poisonous, so they themselves stay away from it and don't consume it. A lot of them question the meat supply, so they only shop at organic butchers, for instance. But where does that leave the public who are following them? Where does that leave the rest of us who are not able to afford that? So it's not only about having the knowledge and keeping it for yourself because you are able to afford it. It's about empowering and educating the masses so that they can at least have an opportunity, you know, to have access to that kind of food. Whether it be now in 10 or 20 years time, we should not give up on this fight.
We've seen this, alhamdulillah, an Islamic value and an Islamic principle being promoted and being mainstreamed globally in terms of riba and in terms of riba-free banking and Sharia compliant banking products. We've seen how this has become popularized to the point where even non-Muslims are interested in, for instance, opening up a Sharia account so that they can, of course, sidestep interest and that kind of thing. And I think if, being a bit optimistic here, but inshallah, if we could do this in the banking sector, this could definitely be done with regards to health, especially where, we're living in a time of social media where there's so many social media influencers that are promoting good health practices and, they perhaps for very materialistic reasons. But, people are becoming conscientized about eating, following a set diet, different types of diets like low carb diets and trying to stay away from unhealthy things, organic products becoming more mainstream and more popular. So I think we can definitely push for this, inshallah. And it makes me think of one of the other instances where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions tayyib in Surah Baqarah, not in connection with halal, but Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu anfiqu min tayyibati ma kasabtum. Oh, you believe, give out or spend from that tayyibat, from those pure sources of earning. So, if we approach this from perhaps a private sector point of view, where we encourage the Muslim private sector to push money into producing tayyib products and promoting tayyib products. Like you mentioned earlier, doctor, something is tayyib, then it is already halal. It's, obviously, if it's tayyib, then it is halal. So, if we can get the private sector to mainstream this idea of tayyib, then I think we've already sort of solved a large part of that problem, because then we've got more tayyib products on the market, which will in any case be certified halal. But it just gives us more options, get us away from Nando's and from KFC and McDonald's and into healthier eating, inshallah.
Inshallah, absolutely. I think we just have to keep talking about it. Once we give up, then we'll continue that fight for us. And I think we have to think about the children. We have to think about those people who cannot advocate for themselves. I always say that yes, I took a Hippocratic oath to ensure that I treat people fairly and I give them the best service that I possibly can. But before that, I took an oath in front of my creator, that when I sit here with that heavy weight, that heavy responsibility to ensure that in every interaction that I have with every single patient, I try and make a difference. And I think if we all have, that kind of mindset, that with every interaction we have with, whether it be on a social level, whether it be, at work, if we interact and we leave a message, if we leave an impression, then surely soon enough this message will filter through. At the moment it's still, not many people are talking about it because it could be seen as an inconvenience, or it's too difficult to change, or I don't know where. But once these producers and healthier, companies in the industry, once they start getting on board, then the products won't be so sparse and expensive, that it would be common practice to see something with tape, and that, non-Muslim people would understand, that as they do halal nowadays. So I think the most important thing is for us to just represent, Islam well in whichever opportunity we have, to live out tape, and to act tape, to act wholesome, to interact in that way, so that people would be more encouraged, would be more, leaning towards wanting to know about Tayyib. So it's a difficult road, and I think, in all honesty, my meeting with the MJC, as I mentioned to them at the time, it was quite disappointing because I'd hoped, presenting the evidence, the undeniable relationship between these foods and diseases, it would kind of spur them on to being a bit more proactive, but I believe that, that's not the end. That's not the only route that we have. And we should just continue this discussion and continue making a noise, even, producing tea products from our kitchen, launching it and getting it out into the community. I think that would conscientize them, approaching the influences, whichever vehicles we have at our disposal, and kind of just ignite, passion within the rest of our community, that soon it will catch on, and it will become norm.
If I may ask, right, while we fight in the good fight, and we still have to organize ourselves, with like-minded individuals to get TAYEB certification, or at least however we want to brand it, because if we're going to brand what we want to basically co-opt others beyond even the Muslim community, we might have to change the words that we're using. So instead of saying tayyib, we might just say, a wholesome certification. But we're talking about that, that health and wholesomeness. But however the branding may be, what tips would you have, for the average South African that will listen to this podcast? What tips do you have, like, on how to start leading a tayyib lifestyle, and making those tayyib health choices when they go into their supermarket or the greengrocer or the butchery, or even they, it's a Saturday night and they want to, get something, some takeout, get a takeaway? What would be the smarter options to start off with?
It's a very important question. We have to always give our community or our listeners some alternatives. So I think there are some major culprits, okay? And if we can kind of steer clear of those major culprits, then it would go a long way. So the first thing, obviously, is to look at your ingredients list and to become familiar with the ingredients contained in those foods, to look at what is seed oil, what is sunflower oil, what is canola oil, know the difference, and know what effect it has in your body. Okay. If you look at sugar, know what is the recommended, so for instance, the World Health Organization, their recommended daily dose of sugar is 6 teaspoons. Okay. So know that, and try and stay within that limits, and the 6 teaspoons of sugar doesn't only go into your cups of coffee or your tea or your porridge. It's overall consumption for the day. So it includes your sugary beverage, it includes the tomato sauce, it includes the mayonnaise, whatever you are using. Be mindful of the sugar content that goes into that product, and opt for things that are sugar-free, or where we have natural sugars that are being used. Okay, stay away from processed meats as far as you can. If you're not able to, then at least don't warm those processed meats, because when you warm the processed meats, you're actually releasing a lot more of the toxins. So it's just simple things to look out for. If you have a baby who is using baby formula, opt for the formula that is free of palm oil, because palm oil is a poison for babies. you know. So those are the basic things. Energy drinks, despite the certification on energy drinks, there is absolutely no nutritional benefit for you to have it. The kick that you're feeling is coming from the caffeine and the sugar um, content in there, but there's actually no nutritional benefit derived from consuming those energy drinks. Make sure that you don't allow your teenagers or your young children to consume those drinks. Oftentimes I see children walking to school in the morning with an energy drink. On the way back home from school is the energy drink. Before a sporting event, there's an energy drink. And oftentimes, because there's a halal certification, there's a halal stamp on there, parents are at ease to allow their, 15 and 16-year-olds to consume that, not knowing that there's an equivalent of 10 cups of coffee and 16 teaspoons of sugar in one energy drink. So it's just the basic things that you consume, even bread, as far as you can try and bake your own breads. Bread has 3, 4 ingredients at most, but the breads that we consume from the shops, there's about 14 or 15 ingredients in there. So we have to be mindful of the simple things. Milk, uh, read up about milk. It's not something that I really want to get into because it's a discussion all on its own, in terms of the fact that our bodies need protein, right? Our bodies need amino acids. It doesn't need red meat. It doesn't, there are other sources of getting those nutrients, as well. If our body needs calcium, it doesn't only come from a glass of milk. So it's important for us to know what are the sources of those nutrients in natural whole foods. Incorporate whole foods, incorporate vegetables, not as a side dish, but as a main dish. And in that way, we lower the consumption of these heavy processed toxin laden foods in our week. Because for instance, if you look at animals, unfortunately they bear the brunt of the most processing. So whether it be eggs, whether it be the chickens, whether it be the cows that produce milk, or the sheep, there's so much hormones, there's so much um, injections that those animals have to get, antibiotics, on a daily basis, and it accumulates in the flesh of that animal, and we consume it. And if you look at breakfast, lunch, and supper, there's an animal somewhere, right? And then so that's 3 times in one day, and then 7 times in a week, we're consuming those products which are heavily laden with those toxins. And where does it go? So we absorb it, our body doesn't know what to do, it gets parked in our joints, we become inflamed, we develop gout, we develop arthritis. Our body starts attacking itself with a rheumatoid condition or autoimmune condition, because there's all these chemicals and hormones signaling inside our body, which we consumed in the products that we've eaten. So I think I particularly called out animal products because our fruits and vegetables are not so heavily processed yet. So it's a healthier option to incorporate more fruits and veg, as meals in our day to day, and be very strict about the amount of times that you consume junk food. It's junk food, and it's called junk food for a reason. The name gives it away. So there's very little nutritional benefit in there, so limit it to once a week, if you have to, or once a month. And I think it's like we said right at the get-go. It's because our community, we have access to it. They are middle income earners. So they're able to have Uber Eats twice a week, out of convenience. But if we just become stricter in our eating culture, it would go a long way in making a difference. There was a recommendation from a study that looked at the harmful effects of sugary beverages on our life, on the human life. And the recommendation in the study, which was a massive umbrella study that was done and published in 2024, the recommendation is to have 200 to 350 mils of a sugary beverage once a week. That's how bad it is. So the recommendation is to have a sugary beverage once a week if you need to have it at all. We're consuming it every day, often with 2 meals a day. So it's just making those informed choices about what actually goes on our table, what we're actually giving to our children, that we will go a long way in preserving our health, before we even get to the Tayyib certification level. So those are just some practical, tips and ideas, a place for the common average Joe to start at, and to look at and to really take into account, what goes into their bodies in a week, you know, and try and optimize that as best as they can.
One final question from my side, and I really, really have to know this. For the teapots and the coffee snobs, because these are the magic drinks that we take, and then it helps us to get stuff done. Health and basically tayyib in terms of our hot our favorite hot beverages. What can you tell us there about that?
So tea and coffee, obviously, I say we live in a coffee culture at the moment. Having coffee is a must. And the age at which we start with coffees is 10, 11, 12. Having iced coffees as a starter. So the exposure to caffeine is happening at a relatively young age. And what happens to your body, when you take a dose of caffeine, your body goes into a fight or flight response mode. So essentially, your adrenal glands are activated, and that kick that you feel is actually coming from the rush of adrenaline that is released in response to that caffeine. Okay, so you can imagine what happens to your poor adrenal glands who have been experiencing this fight or flight response since the age of 10 or 15, and you consume a coffee, two, three coffees a day until you are 50, 60, because it's an accepted beverage. The problem is that adrenals start to wear out, and it almost raises its set point to where it's now going to start reacting. And so when you actually need that, adrenals to kick in for a real life or death situation, the response may be extremely blunted, because you've been used to having that response just to get you through the day. The question we should be asking is, after we sleep and we've had a good 8 hours rest, why is it that we still need a stimulant to actually kick us and wake us up? Why is it that the rest was not enough to reset us and get us ready for that day? So in addition to caffeine being addictive, there is very little nutritional benefit for the consumption of long-term caffeine use. So in tea, obviously caffeine is there, but to a lesser extent. No caffeine in rooibos tea. So it's very important, in addition to the caffeine, what goes with the caffeine? Are you taking it with sugar, without sugar? Are you taking it with milk, without milk? So all those things contribute and add on. And often it leaves you at around 2 o'clock with needing another cup of coffee. So you're living your life from kick to kick from the caffeine. And so you become dependent, you become addicted, to that feeling. So it's a tape discussion all on its own, because what is the real wholesome benefit for you? The food that we eat should be giving us enough energy. The sleep that we have should be giving us enough energy. But again, it's marketed and sold to us as something that we need to have. And so it is something that we can't live without. So personally, I had coffee every single day. I couldn't do without it. 2 years ago, I stopped cold turkey, because I really needed to understand why or what I was lacking. Why was it not enough just having a good night's rest and waking up refreshed for the day? And all I did was make some changes to my diet, and alhamdulillah, waking up, having a cup of rooibos tea, is enough of a kick for me at the moment. So it's all about the mindset and understanding what that caffeine is actually doing to your body when you're taking it, and what is the long-term effect of consuming it for the next 30, 40 years. There's lots of studies looking at caffeine, obviously, and it's not only in our coffee. We're finding it in energy bars. We're finding it, in many different in cakes. It's so it's all around us, and what it's doing is it's just raising that set point for our own adrenal glands, to not really respond when, it's only when a tiger walks in that will respond. When for instance, when a spider walks in, this response is going to be a bit blunted, because our body's been releasing these hormones at such an alarming rate that it almost starts to wear off, if you can understand that.
I feel ashamed to admit now that I'm definitely over caffeinated in general. I think knowing Sheikh Anwar, I'm not alone on this. Both of us are caffeine addicts. But yeah, I've definitely noticed in my own life, there is like I suppose any stimulant probably has this to varying degrees, but with caffeine, I've definitely noticed like a long-term kind of anxiety that maintains, or it goes on even if you stop coffee, even if you take, drink, drink less coffee or try to detox, that kind of anxiousness that the stimulant causes in your body, that still stays in your body for a long time, and you almost become conditioned in that way. So there's definitely so much of the food that's on the market currently that one would want to stay away from if you had enough options. But um, I feel sort of hopeful from what you said, Doctor, earlier about the tips that we can follow in order to try and live a bit of a healthier lifestyle. But in terms of things like all these microplastics and things that we are hearing more and more about, affecting, for instance, testosterone levels in men, affecting female development in adolescence, affecting hormone levels, and it seems it's almost ubiquitous. In any kind of product that you take off the shelf, there's some kind of plastic that's seeped into it. I believe we're breathing plastics in now. Apparently, if you eat fish, if you eat a lot of seafood, you eat the equivalent of like a credit card worth of plastic in a week or something of it. So, is there still a way, and I'm hoping, inshallah, there is, and that doctor will give me some optimism, but is there a way that we can avoid this in our day and age?
Um, Look, it's unfortunate, and I don't want you to lose hope, right? But the industry and the standards are just too low at the moment, to ensure that there's that wholesome wellness, that we are safe from all toxins, right? But I think as the consumer, as the informed consumer, we have the ability to limit that, and to use what is available to almost allow us to detox, to do a heavy metal detox, for instance, to do a parasite cleanse, to get, all the gunk out of us, to fast. And, wallahi, what I've learned in the last 2 years is that the amazing benefits of fasting, how it actually allows your body to cleanse itself naturally. And again, it's something that Allah prescribed to us. And if we follow the lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ, where we consume less, where we fast, twice a week, where we're fasting, on all the prescribed days, in addition to just Ramadan, then that in itself allows our body to detox, naturally. So if we adopt more of the prophetic, lifestyle, it is a measure for us to shield ourselves against the damage that is so pervasive at the moment. And if we cling to Quran, if we cling to Sunnah, then we will not go wrong. If we avoid excess, if we look at the life of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where he consumed meat, every, once a week, or at a occasion, it wasn't every single day with every meal, then we can limit that harm. If we opt for, bottling in glass our water, as opposed to bottling in plastic, if we opt to go to the natural spring instead of drinking water out of our taps, for instance, small things which would have significant changes, then I don't think all hope is lost. You know, we've been put on this earth, and we have to make the most of it. It's not about, doom and gloom, and giving up hope and saying that, we're doomed and they're poisoning us from every aspect. I think knowledge is key and knowledge is critical. And those of us who have the knowledge, it's almost incumbent on us to share that knowledge, so that we can help and safeguard somebody else. Maybe a credit card, a plastic credit card is better than a whole packet, for instance, which is not ideal, but it's the best. We're trying to do the best with what we've been given. And I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees that, and He would bless ventures that are going to promote that, you know. So I don't think we should ever feel alone and isolated if we're going to do Allah's work, if we're going to advocate for Allah's way. even in a non-Islamic environment, Allah is going to make a way for us, and that's what I hold on to, in every aspect of my life. It's what I teach my kids, and what I think we should all hold on to as well, So don't be too sad, don't be too disheartened in terms of the condition that we find ourselves in. I think there's always a way out, as long as we know the intention, behind why we're doing what we're doing, I think Allah will open the rest of the doors for us.
The fight, the very noble fight for Tayyib certification so that everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim, can enjoy better health and better wellness because they're eating the good things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided for all of humanity. It's going to be a long one, but it's definitely something much needed. And you are going to be in our du'as, you and your colleagues, and inshallah we will join you as well to work towards, inshallah, better health. We'd like to thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. And we hope to engage you again in the future, inshallah.
Shukran so much. May Allah allow your show to grow from strength to strength, inshallah. And I'll definitely be following you from now on. Shukran.
شكرا جزيلا. جزاك الله
Jazakallah
خيرا.
khairan.
السلام عليكم.
Wa alaikum salam.